Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to this edition of, the third edition of talks in our series Women in World Affairs, after Jill Abramson and Judge John Donoghue earlier this year. It's a series that we're very happy to have established, and that's very much thanks to Jacqueline Coté, but also especially to our partner, the US mission in Geneva, and it's great that this has taken off, especially because it's good not only to decry the underrepresentation of women everywhere, but especially also in world affairs, but also to highlight the very important contributions and the presence of women in that field. And so, in a sense, kind of that visibility, I think, is something that we hope to enhance with that series. I'm very happy that this works. Now, today we're very happy to have Ambassador Elizabeth Cousins with us, really an ideal fit for the series. She is Deputy CEO of the UN Foundation, foundation that really is supporting UN work in all kinds of ways, kind of sort of, in a sense, by doing projects, outreach, building communities around global goals. She's overseeing all work on policy, advocacy, and communications at the foundation. And she's been steeped in the ways of internationalism, you can say, forever, having worked both for the US government, especially during the Obama administration, in the US mission at the UN, having worked for the UN itself, having worked at think tanks like the International Peace Institute, having negotiated the SDGs. So for decades, really, she has been spending life in and around the UN multilateral processes, sort of living that world that we often observe as academics from somewhat a little of distance, but she has been really in it for a long time. Not only that, obviously, she's also kept writing about it, so in a sense, kind of taking a step back as a critical observer of it, especially on issues of peace building and peacemaking, that she's contributed to a great deal over the years. And she obviously has a strong academic background with a PhD from Oxford that reaches kind of way back to her academic roots. So we're very happy to have her. I think it's really, it's rather obvious from her trajectory that there are few people who could kind of more ably speak about the topic that we have on for today, multilateralism and its discontents. The UN's relevance today and the future of cooperation. Now, that's a big topic, but one that is somewhat on everybody's minds around Geneva, around the UN in New York, but in lots of capitals and lots of places in the world. But also in lots of villages, you could say. If you look at Switzerland, where in just a good week, there's going to be a referendum on what to do with international law and whether maybe foreign judges ought to have a more limited role. The discontents of multilateralism are very visible throughout, and obviously it's a difficult task to disentangle and understand the dynamics that shape that kind of discontent. But we're very much looking forward to your lecture, Elizabeth, and then to questions and answers afterwards.
Well, thank you very much, Nico, and good evening to all of you. It's a real delight to be here. I'm going to have to decide whether I forgive you for the "I've been in it forever" comment, because I, may feel like I've been around a while, but I don't want to think it's been quite forever. But it's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Graduate Institute and the U.S. Mission for this invitation and for this series, which I think is a really important platform for conversations the kind I'm looking forward to tonight. So it's really a pleasure to be here to have an opportunity to reflect on the times we are in, the future we face, and the role of the United Nations for future cooperation. So I've spent my career, as Nico was describing, on different sides of the UN. I've served in peace operations, I've sat behind my country's placard, I've been a researcher. I've been one of those sleep-deprived negotiators trying to cut deals in basement conference rooms, including with a couple of people who are in this room who shall remain nameless. And I've been a critic as well as an advocate of the UN. And the UN has seen many debates over the years about what it can be at its highest and best, and what to do when it falls short. And many of those debates have been tough. Some of you will remember 15 years ago when John Bolton, who is now the US National Security Advisor, went to the UN as the US Permanent Representative, started his job by shredding a laboriously negotiated landmark agreement on UN reform, subsequently put back together, and declared that if the UN lost 10 floors, no one would notice. Now, I want to talk tonight about some of the very real ways that people would notice, that countries, including the United States, would notice, that civilians in the middle of war would notice, that women would notice, children would notice, that businesses would notice, and that citizens and advocates would notice. And I want to make the case that we take aim at the UN today at our peril. Because today the issue isn't just whether the UN is delivering in peace and human rights and development. It is all those things, which are rightly a priority, and it's part of what I and my colleagues at the UN Foundation spend our time on every day. But today we are also seeing the whole premise of the UN, the idea that countries gain from cooperation, or that there are common human values that can unite us across even deep differences, being questioned. And that raises the stakes in this very old debate tremendously. So I want to use this time with you to talk about why multilateralism is more vital than ever, why the UN is more vital than ever, but also why and how both need to change with the times. So first, a bit about multilateralism. The former US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, once famously said that people don't like the word multilateralism. They don't like it because it has too many syllables and it ends with an ism. Well, whether or not you like the word, what it means, which is basically that countries and their citizens will do better and go farther by working together than by going it alone, is vital for all of us. So first, let's dispense with any illusion that we don't need it. Wherever we live, whatever community we call home, there is virtually no domain of our lives that is not made better by more effective multilateral action. It took multilateralism to defeat smallpox. I think we're all grateful for that. It took multilateralism to close the hole in the ozone layer and vaccinate record numbers of children against preventable diseases after the world adopted the Millennium Development Goals. It took multilateralism to secure vital freedoms for women and beat back the scourge of HIV/AIDS. And it has taken multilateralism to contain the risks of nuclear confrontation. Multilateralism brought us rules and standards that govern air safety, international shipping, and mail. You want domain names for the internet? That has something to do with multilateralism too. There are, of course, times when a country may need to act on its own for reasons of values or interests, or to take risks or show leadership when others won't or can't. But the interdependence of today's world means that no country will be able to succeed in the long term without working multilaterally in some form. Climate change, rising inequality, advances in technology that will upend the nature of work, antimicrobial resistance, the spread of organized criminal networks, it's hard to see any major threat on the contemporary global landscape that can be successfully overcome without collective action and on a heroic scale. And it's not all about threats. The phenomenal gains in human well-being that we have achieved over the last generation, gains that we rightly celebrate in income levels, in decimating child mortality, in education, in environmental protection, all stand to be advanced substantially in future years and limited only by our imagination and our ability to work together. So in short, multilateralism doesn't mean that countries give up their interests. It just means a more effective and enduring way of advancing them. So what then about the United Nations? So the UN is only one expression of multilateral action, if a central one, and its reputation frequently takes a beating. So I want to look a little closer at the UN itself, and I'm going to use the UN as shorthand, even though, of course, the UN is many things. It's its membership, it's the Secretary General and UN leaders, it's operational agencies and missions, and we can unpack that a bit in conversation, but it's easy to use shorthand for now. The UN is about to turn 75 in 2 years, and it's worth reflecting a little on how dramatically the world has changed in that time. In 1945, 51 countries made up the UN, and there are now 193. And across all the ways that the world has changed since 1945, the UN has somewhere played a role, and I would argue a broadly positive role, sometimes a vital role, and at times even a path-breaking role. The UN accompanied decolonization and was part of the path to independence for dozens of new states that helped make up those 193 members. The UN helped blunt the edges of the Cold War, which gripped the world for too long until it ended 30 years ago. The UN's landmark conferences helped propel the movement for women's rights, and the UN laid the groundwork for institutional innovations ranging from Gavi and the Global Fund to the International Criminal Court. Yes, the UN has had some searing failures, but it has also had a record of achievement that is part of the fabric of how we know and appreciate the world today. And let me give just a few further examples. Some of you in this room are very close to all of these conversations and histories, but I don't think we would have the notion of human development without the UN. I'm not sure we'd have sustainable development in the way we have it today without the UN. They're both path-breaking concepts, and the UN was a critical part of creating space for those ideas to take root, to build support for them, and then to press further to think about what the practical implications were for countries and communities around the world. We certainly wouldn't have the Millennium Development Goals without the UN. Yes, they built on many threads and years of important work by many others. And they weren't the UN's creation, but they landed at the UN, and the UN helped give them lift and leverage. And without the Millennium Development Goals, we wouldn't have some of the very real and very human gains of the last 20 years. So just to make this very concrete, according to even the most conservative estimates, the MDGs saved between 20 and 30 million people's lives. Most of them were children who didn't die before the age of 5. Some of them were people who survived HIV/AIDS due to expanded treatment, some because of the decline in deaths from tuberculosis, some the decline in maternal mortality. But that's 20 to 30 million people who are alive today who by most accounts would not otherwise be were it not for that commitment that world leaders made at the UN. Or consider climate change. The UN has been essential in establishing global scientific consensus around the urgency and trajectories of climate change, and it has been key to building political consensus on climate, notwithstanding challenges and obvious reversals we're contending with today. So when the United States and China did their climate deal on the eve of the Paris Agreement, they delivered it to the UN. Why did they do that? They did that so that their bilateral commitment would have even greater force because they understood the power of leverage and they understood the power of winning friends to your cause. So let's also look at peace and security for a moment, and this is part of my early history. My original background in the UN was working on peace processes and on conflict management. The UN was a critical ingredient of stability during the Cold War. That was before my time, I'm happy to say. It didn't alone keep the US and the Soviet Union from going to war, of course not. But it took the sharpest edges off of their rivalry, and it gave them arena to fight and compete in a different way. And it brought both of those powers into a system of collective security that, by and large, they both held to and held others to. The UN has also had frontline mediators in the world's toughest conflicts going back to its very origins, starting with Count Folke Bernadotte, who was assassinated in the Middle East in 1948, through people like Alvaro de Soto and Jean Arnault, who helped end the civil wars in Central America at the very first years after the end of the Cold War, to someone like Martin Griffiths, who's in Yemen today. The UN invented peacekeeping, which has gone through rounds of evolution since its first operation to supervise the truce after the Israeli-Arab War in 1948, to the peacekeeping presence the UN fields today of over 100,000 troops and civilians in 14 different theaters of conflict around the world. And actually, over the last decade, that deployment has been relatively steady by the UN, and it represents the second largest deployment of military and civilian forces for that purpose in the world, second only to the United States. Now, just this year, UN peacekeepers marked the successful conclusion of UN peace operations in Liberia after 15 years, Liberia being a country that saw two of the most vicious and destructive civil wars of the last century and that is now at peace. The UN wound down in Cote d'Ivoire, having successfully concluded a mission there, and over the years, the UN has helped demobilize combatants in places like Angola, Cambodia, Mozambique, Nepal. They supported the independence of new states like Timor-Leste and Kosovo, stabilized an armistice between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And again, There were failures, but there were also successes, and we need to understand that record. Because the world does seem on fire today, it is easy to forget that over the course of the 1990s and 2000s, UN peace operations were a critical reason for a historic drop, a plummeting almost, in levels of conflict around the world, the number of conflicts and the lethality of conflicts. That's only recently started to tick back up again. And the UN is understood by, I think, many who observe conflict processes and patterns around the world to have been heavily a contributor to that very positive trajectory. And remember that the UN goes to places that others don't. The UN doesn't tend to get sent to the easy cases or the places where parties just want to get along. They get sent to hard, messy, complicated, and increasingly dangerous environments. So it's no surprise that results are mixed, and there is a record of both success and failure. But failure, like success, is also rarely singular, and the reality is often more nuanced. And I want to just give you one example from my own background in the Middle East. I worked for a number of years for the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process. It was almost 20 years ago, at a moment that was supposed to lead to a final peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians, coming essentially out of the Oslo process. And I was lucky enough to work for one of the savviest UN diplomats there was, who in fact was one of the main architects of the Oslo process. And when we started, we had peace in our sights. When we left, the Second Intifada had started, a wall was being erected between Palestinians and Israelis, and not too many years later, Hamas would control Gaza and the prospects for peace would look bleaker than ever. Not a positive outcome overall. But in the middle of all that, I want to tell you this story. In the middle of all of that, we got closer to a final status agreement between Israel and the Palestinians that there has ever been before or since. It built on years of intensive negotiations, but the parties worked out elements of a deal in the Taba talks. Many of you will be familiar with the Taba talks. That essentially was close to a final deal on almost every final status issue that vexes that region and those parties. The UN, along with a number of critical third parties, was essential to that effort. We helped generate ideas, we came up with options, we created space, we provided cover. We were part of that ecosystem of mediators that often get involved in the thorniest of conflicts. And we didn't ultimately succeed, as is very obvious, and there are many reasons for that, starting with, I would say, factors over which we really had no control. But in getting that close, the UN did remarkable work, and it was a genuine bright spot, and it's important to see where those exist, even in contexts that overall do not succeed. Sorry. So what I take from that experience and many others that I've been privileged enough to observe or be part of in different contexts, particularly from the UN's peace and security role, I draw a few lessons. An obvious one is that you don't get into peace work because it's easy or because the victories are simple. You do it because it matters. The second is that the UN has been innovating from the beginning, from the creation of peacekeeping to sending civil affairs teams who accompanied mediators in the Congo in the 1960s to things like the responsibility to protect. And the third I took from that experience was that the UN is never in it alone, one way or the other. You know, my work in the Middle East was as much with the Americans, with the European Union, with regional players, with the World Bank, with a bunch of creative academics who were completely enmeshed in the fabric of peacemaking at the time. And the UN is always part of an ecosystem of actors who either work well together or don't, and either share common purpose or don't, which makes it all the more concerning if there is a drift, or worse, away from the UN and what it stands for, and how it can be, in the best cases, a powerful instrument for collective action against even some of our toughest challenges. So having said a few things about multilateralism, that today I think we really can't get along without it, and having said a bit about the UN and its complicated record with a snapshot of a few achievements, what does the future look like for the UN and multilateralism going forward? Now, it's clear that today multilateralism generally and the UN are under extreme pressure, and for many reasons, not only the rise of challenges from specific capitals or nationalist impulses that we talk about a lot these days. Some of the strains have been building for years, and some are more acute, but the upshot is that this is a system under extreme duress. Yet we need this system to survive, not only to survive, but actually to become even better, to become more agile, more dynamic, and more capable of helping us navigate the complexities of this century, which arguably are even greater than those of the last. So what is to be done? I would suggest looking at this challenge on at least 3 dimensions. First, we clearly need to renovate and strengthen existing institutions. Now, the UN at the moment is undertaking a comprehensive reform agenda to make it fit for purpose to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals and better fit to grapple with the peace, security, and turbulent challenges of the future. And that includes modernizing the way it works, including with civil society, with business, and others who are vital to solving today's challenges. And it's hard, important work that deserves support and steady attention. Second, we need to cultivate forms of multilateral action that may look quite different from those institutions and the ones that we have today. And here I think we're already seeing some very interesting and fresh dynamics. We're seeing new actors and some very interesting creativity about what multilateralism could evolve into in the 21st century. One obvious place to point you to is just earlier this week, the convening of the Paris Peace Forum, what is intended to be an annual event to convene all kinds of actors, players, thinkers around new solutions in the multilateral arena and to begin to build support for what those might look like. But consider also some of the ways that actors are organizing around climate change. This is an area that I work on now quite a lot. The UN Foundation does quite extensively. In the United States, for example, there's an umbrella group of nearly 3,000 private and public sector leaders who represent more than $6 trillion in US gross domestic product, who have come together under a banner of something called America's Pledge to deliver on the US federal government's commitment under the Paris Climate Agreement. There's a bipartisan group of US governors representing the equivalent of the world's 3rd largest economy after the United States and China that has been created to do exactly the same thing. Federal commitments on the one hand, a group of sub-state and non-state actors banding together to deliver on them. That's really interesting as a phenomenon and consequential, I think. The Sustainable Development Goals have also stimulated new forms of collective action on their own, from businesses to local government, and we're now seeing cities come forward to undertake what they're calling voluntary local reviews about their own contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. So cities, states, civil society, companies are showing us some fresh ways to think about multilateral action and responsibility, and that's a trend to embrace. But third, I think we need to think about power. So we just marked the centennial of the end of the First World War. And when the First World War ended, there was supposed to be lasting peace. It was meant to be the war to end all war. But the League of Nations that came after the First World War never really captured the political imagination of the powerful. No great powers really stepped up to lead. The Great Depression happened, leaders looked inward, and an even more destructive global war unfolded, obviously only 2 decades later. And it was the aftermath of that war, Second World War, that gave us the United Nations. But this time, unlike the League of Nations, the world's great powers, however uneasy and combative the relations among them, forged an organization that reflected their deepest interests. They committed to share responsibility for collective security, and they built an institution that gave great powers greater responsibilities as stewards of the whole system. Now today we have a more transitional picture. We have new powers rising, old powers looking inward. We have rising distrust in many quarters and a renewed temptation for some to go it alone. So there is also an urgent need today to build or rebuild a new political coalition underneath both core institutions like the UN and new institutions we may yet build that can withstand the sorts of pressures that buffet us. I would also say, when we're thinking about power, that we do need to think about more democratic forms of power and ways to use that intentionally to build even stronger habits of cooperation. And I want to turn now to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a topic that many of you have been involved in creating and are very much, I think, a part of making real in the world today. The SDGs have been called the product of the most inclusive UN negotiation in history. And having suffered through more than a few, I can attest to the fact that it felt very inclusive to me. Now, I was the US negotiator on the SDGs, and I want to tell you 2 stories about that process that hint to me at ways that we might revitalize multilateralism and collective action at such a crucial time. The first is about negotiators. We're a kind of funny, cranky, and very sometimes combative bunch. But here's something that happened with the SDGs that had never happened, at least in my experience, before. For a number of arcane reasons having to do with how the negotiations were set up. The groups that usually dominate UN negotiations did not have a place at the table. The European Union was essentially at the back of the line. The Group of 77 was essentially at the back of the line. And what that meant was that unusually, countries large and small spoke for themselves. Smaller countries found their voice in a way that I have never seen in my UN experience before. Africa in particular found its voice. And to add to the mix, countries were mixed up into different constituency groups who had to pre-negotiate, and they were mixed across all kinds of boundaries. So it was a very unusual negotiating process. Now, you may know that among the goals that emerged in the SDGs, one of the toughest fought and most challenging was Goal 16, the goal on peace, justice, and governance. We would not have that goal without the structure of that process, and we would not have that goal without Africa, without countries like Liberia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Timor-Leste, countries who had lived through their own civil wars, championing the case. Now, interestingly, all of those countries are also countries whose peace processes were in some fashion shepherded by the UN. And we would not have heard their voices so forcefully if we'd been in a traditional negotiation. And that, to me, was an incredibly energizing experience, first of all, but it also was a glimmer of what it can be like when countries genuinely speak from the authentic interests that they have and speak in their own voice. So the lesson that I take from that is that that's at least one clear path to revitalizing multilateralism. If we diversify voices, if we hear what countries really want, we enrich debate, but we also expand the scope for solution and shared purpose, and that's exactly what happened with the SDGs. The second SDG story is about citizens. And many of you will be familiar with this too, but at the beginning of the negotiations, the UN launched something called the My World Survey to canvass popular views about what the SDGs should cover, what people cared about. And by the time they wrapped up the survey, it had reached 10 million people, I think in every member state of the UN. The results of that survey, I can just tell you personally, were absolutely material to the negotiations. They were material to the debates I had internally in Washington about how to shape US policy, because we heard how widely, including in our own country, people cared about education, what they cared about. They cared about remarkably common things. The top 6 were education, health, jobs, honest and responsive governance was the 4th highest priority worldwide, and security, the absence of violence. And we also heard about essentials like nutritious food and access to water and so on. But it shaped our agenda and it shaped the outcome. So the lesson I take from that is that citizens, especially when they are asked, especially when they are well organized, have a vital role to play directly on the international stage, and especially in the demands that they make of their own governments, their employers, and their leaders about the world they want to see. So I just want to conclude with a reflection now on my own country, the United States. You know, the US historically has been a traditional underwriter of multilateral institutions, even at times when the government has been sharply critical of them. And we're today watching a new drama unfold in which the US is increasingly seen by some as one of the chief threats to the multilateral order. And yet we also see a groundswell of new and diverse Americans calling for the opposite. And I just want to give you a flavor for that. Polling last year by the leading group that tracks US views on the UN, a group called the Better World Campaign, with which we're actually affiliated, found that 88% of Americans want the United States, bipartisan poll, I will say, want the United States to maintain an active role in the United Nations. A full 83% of Americans believe that it is better for the United States to work through allies and international organizations than to go it alone. 83%. You don't get figures like that in very much that you poll on these days. Earlier this year, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which is this umbrella organization that pulls together all city and municipal leaders across the entire country, issued a resolution calling for U.S. global leadership and for full American engagement in the UN. The United Nations Association of the United States has seen a 25% growth in new chapters on college campuses alone over the last 12 months. And last June, over 500 of those delegates, a record turnout, descended on Washington for 2 days to carpet Capitol Hill, meet with their legislators, and argue the case for strong U.S. support for the UN with virtually every member of the U.S. Congress. So in short, Americans in many forms, beyond the federal government, are reaffirming the importance of global action and of international cooperation. They get that now is the time for all of us to explore new ways to strengthen our collective ability to act and with united purpose. I think they get that today's global challenges, from cybersecurity to climate change to inequality, need us to work together and at scale. Now, we have a multilateral system that has stood an incredible test of time and continues to evolve in impressive ways. We also have an opportunity to bring fresh imagination to how multilateralism needs to innovate around new issues and with new actors. And I just, on that, want to end with words from a true multilateral champion and a giant on the world stage, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who also made this city his home. Of all the many things he was as a leader, a humanitarian, and a human being, he was convinced that collective action was essential to secure our future. At the turn of this millennium, he said, "More than ever before in human history, we share a common destiny. We can master it only if we face it together. And that is why we have the United Nations." He sometimes called the challenges we face today problems without passports. Microbes and mosquitoes don't respect borders, and neither do extremism or weaponized ideas, but nor do forces for positive change, like innovation, technological advance, and solidarity. So we all now need to be champions of multilateralism, and we all now need to put our creative energies and passions into making it stronger. We can use a few syllables if we want to follow Madeleine Albright, and we can maybe even lose the ism, but we cannot afford to lose our way. And that is a task on which we need to embark together. So I thank you and I look forward to the conversation. And I discovered that having a tilted podium is very challenging when you have papers. So.
I should have shown you. I could have, I think.
There was a technical.
Well, it's not. It never works entirely well. Yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth. It was a fascinating talk. I think a really kind of a rallying cry around something that most of us, or kind of all of us, really believe in, and sort of showing us how in the relatively gloomy state in which discussions about international order are, right? We can carve out a vision of the UN that is really, really geared around great things done, great things achieved, and possibilities that are there and can be taken forward. So thank you so much. Really, kind of a great picture of the UN, kind of past, present, and future, one could say. But maybe in order to start off, before I open up the discussion for the broader audience, maybe let me start with a question. In a sense that sounds all so great, so why are so many people so skeptical, right? Would be the question. If we have these great polling results in the US, and we have decent ones in Europe, I think, too, although there's variation, obviously, across the world. Why do we see so much of a backlash, and a populist backlash against international institutions? Why does it have such a resonance, it seems? And what do we need to understand about that backlash in order to counter it somehow and to get that story that you've just told across?
Yeah, and I'm not sure, is this on? It is, great. So I think there are a number of different dimensions. It's exactly the right and a challenging question, and I think there are a number of different aspects to it. I mean, one is that support is very broad. It still needs to be deeper. So that is something that a number of advocates work on. I think we all need to work on in our respective communities about how to deepen the understanding of the value that international institutions bring to people right at home. That's about storytelling. That's about evidence. It's about many different things. To really deepen that base of support is one. Two, I think the backlash you see against international institutions isn't only about them, and sometimes it's not much about them at all. They're a very easy rallying cry that channel discomfort and unhappiness and anxiety about totally different things. So I think some of that is about the very deep task that we have in many of our societies, which isn't per se about multilateralism. It's actually about how people understand their own identity, what they believe the social bonds are that connect them to each other, to people who are different from them. That's a part of the foundation of the values of what makes something like the UN work and what it's about. But those are very real and very, I think, very challenging questions for all of us. They're certainly challenging in the United States. I think they're challenging in a lot of European contexts and, frankly, in other countries as well. So that the UN and multilateral institutions may reap the costs of some of those deeper fissures in society, but the repair that needs to be done is not about the international system. It's actually about very, very deep work we need to do at home.
Yeah, thanks. I think it sounds very, very plausible, but somehow, in a sense, kind of international institutions are then kind of, maybe they're falsely credited for all kinds of ills, right, of the world, for transformations that we see, but sort of setting that image right and kind of disentangling a bit sort of who is responsible for what, obviously is a major challenge, and it's not really clear that many politicians or civil society leaders are necessarily interested in deflecting the blame from the international, which is actually often kind of an easy scapegoat. I found it fascinating when I first spent time in the US, kind of that recurring story of the black helicopters that supposedly somewhere came in flying from the UN into the air. It struck me as such a strong image. I don't know how many people actually do believe in that kind of image, but it has such a sort of media recurrence. It's kind of interesting, but it also shows kind of what an absurd association of overwhelming power of an institution that is actually relatively powerless has been created in the minds of people, and how to take that out, I think, is something that many elites just haven't figured out yet, or even haven't really tackled.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's one way in which those of us who believe in the UN and who've been advocates for the UN in different ways haven't always done the UN a favor. Because we've often talked about the world of the UN in very in normative terms that make it seem as though the UN is on one side and sovereignty is on the other. I'm not someone who believes that, and I've never talked that way, but I'm frequently in conversations where if you talk a lot about global governance, it's a real thing and we all work on it, but if you talk about it too much, it begins to mask the fact that the institutions are made up of sovereign states who've chosen to be part of them, chosen to create them, chosen to underwrite them in different ways because they actually advance their interests. I mean, sometimes it's about altruism, but a lot of times it's just about a more effective way to advance national interests. That's perfectly fine. That's what they're about. It's a very different narrative about why international institutions, alliances, and others exist. And again, I think sometimes the best friends of those organizations have made it harder to tell that story. Now, having said that, I'm also speaking particularly from perhaps a narrative that works or doesn't work in a country like my own, but in some countries, the global governance narrative works brilliantly. So it really depends on the audience, the political culture, and how people understand the best ways for them to live the most realized lives as citizens and as countries.
Yeah, thanks. Someone in a small country, I think like Switzerland, often you would think that kind of that perspective would come out more clearly, right? That the need to engage, the need to be together with others, to build alliances and coalitions is stronger. But yet there too, I mean, I think that that discourse of what is in there for us, kind of how is that actually enhancing our ability to govern ourselves properly, something that's sometimes also missing, but would be very necessary. All right, so let's open it up and see if there are questions, comments, answers to some of the questions that we've
Provocations.
had here. Provocations, criticism. Okay, yeah. So the provocations has sparked imagination. Very good. Could you just briefly say who you are?
He actually doesn't need to, but I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Antonio Donini. I'm I guess a repentant multilateralist, I'm part of an organization that's been created very recently entitled United Against Inhumanity. And I wanted to ask Elizabeth, there was a letter to the Lancet at the time of the fall of Aleppo that basically started by saying, if the bombing of Guernica was the last nail in the coffin of the League of Nations, will the bombing of Aleppo, will the fall of Aleppo be the same for the United Nations? Will it make the UN irrelevant? And this was not written by some radical academic or NGO person. It was written by the permanent representative of France François Delattre, and a French academic. So I agree with a lot of what you said, but I noticed that there were a few things missing. In particular, the failure of the Security Council to address the violence that is permeating places like Yemen and Syria and many other places. And the inability of the UN to deal with these issues, and the sort of, it's not only the UN that's responsible, it's the states behind it. I mean, what we're seeing in Europe in terms of asylum is also, I think, a symptom of the decline of multilateralism.
Yeah, so I mean, so it's wonderful to see you again. So Antonio and Nora both. I'm realizing as I look out into the room, I see a number of very dear friends. So it's a crucial question. You're right, I didn't go into detail in my remarks, but I think you could as much ask the question, is it about the irrelevance of the United Nations, or is it about just the failure of the states who are party to those decisions or non-decisions in the Council? So I mean, I fully take the point, and not in any way to get the Security Council or members of it off any kind of hooks, but I think the real question to me is actually less the Council itself than it is about the choices that different member states are making. And if I ask myself, is it better to have a Council that is not functioning terribly well at the moment and is stuck in very, very deep ways and with horrific consequences, or not to have one? I think I would argue I'd want to keep one. I want to try to fix it. I think we need to think about ways, and I don't want to get into perhaps the very thorny conversations about Security Council reform, because that is an issue but not the only issue. But I think it's a more fundamental set of questions that we really need to be asking ourselves about, again, about interests, about concert, about what the conditions are that will create the right kind of incentives, domestically as well as internationally, for capitals who have influence to step up and do the right thing. And there are a lot of different dimensions to that. Again, some of them are every bit as domestic as they are international. The Security Council becomes the symbolic expression of that collective failure. You're absolutely right. I don't think that says, at least it doesn't say to me, that the UN is irrelevant. It says we need to fix it. And that's sort of what I take out of that. And we need to fix a number of other things around it too, because alone it's not the answer.
Thank you. Janos Pastor, and another multilateralist, and but I did want to come back to the Security Council reform, but not in a simple way, because it's complicated, but looking at it more as an overall governance of this structure, the United Nations. And clearly the Security Council is at the top, and it is probably the most unrepresentative body of today's world that we could imagine. And then on the other side, you talked about the engaging the citizens and getting their input, and they are probably the most representative. But how do you do that? And how do you connect these two ends? And I don't know if you have your crystal glass for how this will go forward, but do you see some other way of governing the system, or that is not just simply a little improvement here and there, but actually doing it quite differently?
Yeah, well, I think I definitely don't have a crystal ball or an answer. I'm of the view that incrementalism is unlikely to be very effective. So I think we are of all times at a time where we need to create the space for some much deeper thinking about new ways of organizing ourselves around collective challenges, around new ways of building a politics to support that. I think we need to do serious work to think about different scenarios around particular issues so that we can really think through together in different forms what are the ways that we can organize around some common effort and action. So I share, I think, the premise of your question. I do think quite a lot of work does need to be done at the national level, because ultimately, to the extent that there are member states who are the constitutive members of any kind of, at the core of any kind of international arrangements, the political leadership of those countries are heavily affected, not just by what happens among their peers, but very much by what happens at home. And so that is a kind of very deep set of tasks that have to happen in a lot of countries to build that support at the citizen level, because to me that is not a short-term fix, and it's a very messy process. I will say, I mean, I use the SDGs as an example, and they're not the hardest example. I would take that. The other example is actually the election of Secretary General. I mean, I am of the view, I think probably many people are in this room, we would not have the Secretary General probably that we have today, and I'm of those who think that we're really lucky to have the one we have today, without a degree of civil society engagement that shaped the selection process in a way that, yes, it went through the Security Council and obviously the General Assembly after that, but it shaped the parameters for what council members thought and did, how they perceived candidates, and it definitely played an influential role in being able to shape the way that those countries saw the slate of candidates. It's just one other example, but I think we're kind of at an emergent moment where there are lots of different expressions of political action and leadership in different ways. I think it's messy. Again, I don't think there's a specific route, but I think we need to try quite a lot of different approaches in order to figure out what the best and most productive path is.
There was a question here, there, and then always a bit blinded to see in the back, so please, hands up there in the back.
Hello, I'm Mahmoud Samandari from the Global Challenges Foundation Working Group. You mentioned about the necessity to fix it, to improve it, to make some modifications. What would be the three most important items that you would address while either reforming it or trying to tackle the
Well, you're putting me on the spot. I'm going to make a lot of enemies with my answer. It's very hard to say what the top three are. I happen to be one of those who believes there are certain situations in which vetoes don't make sense. But I think the main thing, and there are a lot of different ways to tackle this, is essentially the representation challenge and the degree to which the Council looks like the world we're in today as opposed to the world we were in over 70 years ago. I think that still means a small number of countries who hold permanent seats, but I think the whole question of how you begin to look at the structure of decision-making in the Council, inclusion of different parties in those decisions, that doesn't have to be done through membership in the Council, expanding a membership or the nature of the membership. There are lots of different ways to do it, but that core challenge of making decision-making something that more parties participate in when they have a particular stake in issues before the Council is something that is essential to crack, not just for legitimacy, but especially for effectiveness and implementation of Council mandates. So I would direct attention. And I know you're doing tremendous work in that area too, so we need more entities like the Global Challenges Foundation too.
Good evening, Derek Kreiser-Skalber. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm working for a small think tank who's trying to find new solutions to address some of those negative externalities. And I have to first congratulate you, because in the last couple of years, the way the UN has engaged with the private sector and the financial sector is quite amazing. And you've become really a broker of building bridges. And my question is really actually a simple one. Is try to understand from inside, how have you achieved actually such a transformation? Because from the outside, the UN 10 years ago is not the UN today. And I was just wondering actually how you've been able to push actually this new type of behavior and bridges towards agility, because at the end, that's what we need, some type of a new global social contract to address those challenges together. Thank you.
Well, I think the world, in a way, is part of the answer of making it possible and making it interesting for UN leaders in the first instance to be trying to find new ways of working. I think you're seeing really, I mean, and I want to ask, I'm tempted to call on people in this room who have a deeper experience with kind of the membership than I do, but who you're seeing new dynamics among the membership at the UN, some of them positive, some of them retrograde, but it's more of it's a more dynamic environment in many ways, I think, than it was for some time, and that creates all kinds of possibilities. I think when the question comes up about how you engage the private sector in particular and how the UN has opened up over time to that, I think there are a lot of ingredients to it, and sometimes it is about long-hold cultivation of new ways of thinking. I mean, the Global Compact was created 20 years ago. That was an initiative of Kofi Annan, John Ruggie, and people like that, and that was an important ingredient. in both socializing within the UN community, the kinds of things that companies of different sizes and types around the world could do to be part of public goods, and an important part of socializing to the corporate community, the ways in which their interests were advanced by the things that the UN does and ways that they might work together. I think what we've found in some of our more direct work on public-private collaborations is that the more you can focus on specific problem areas that you can identify, you can roll up your sleeves and try to think about how to work together on, the more productive you'll be, because you're closer to what are the genuine interests of people on any side of the table. You can be pragmatic and practical about that, and it gets you out of some of the more philosophical debates about who has what roles and why, and much more in the zone of problem solving. It doesn't mean you can solve every problem you set out to, but I think it makes it more fruitful. And I think you see that a lot in the climate arena, you see it a lot in the sustainability arena. And the only kind of final point I would make on this is that I do think we're seeing, and there are all kinds of expressions of this, in, again, big generalization, the corporate sector, but one is seeing in the private sector, I think, so many shifts in recognizing the way the market needs to internalize some of the things that they have historically made external to their own business models, and the degree to which their own abilities to profit as companies, to add value to everyone from their customers to their employees, is dependent on a kind of infrastructure of public goods that maybe they've taken for granted. And so you are seeing an openness, not everywhere, but I think in a pretty interesting way in a lot of different sectors and geographies, an interest from company leaders and corporate leaders to think much more seriously about social benefit, about the way that their business models can have social benefit. And it's a kind of early and emergent set of dynamics, but quite an important one, I think, to capture. And I'm pleased to see the degree to which the UN is really embracing that in a lot of different ways across the system.
Thank you, Ambassador, for this wonderful conversation. And I'm a student here at the Graduate Institute, and I'm also a supporter for multilateralism. My question is related to the role of the United States in multilateralism. And since we have seen in the year of 2011 when the United States has defunded UNESCO over the Palestinian cause, and last year we have also seen the US government defunded UNFPA, while also at the same time the Secretariat itself also saw major funding cuts. But at the same time, we also see that the US contribution to agencies like UNHCR, World Food Program, and UNICEF has always remained high. And at the same time, these are agencies where the senior leadership are more or less always American. And understanding there are also real competition among UN agencies in terms of operation, especially in the field. My question is there any possibility that in the future that large donors or great powers can actually use the power of the purse to kill certain UN agencies that they do not like or could not influence, and at the same time strengthen the ones that they actually do?
So, I mean, the power of the purse for any member state contributing to the UN, which is all of them in some form or fashion, ultimately comes from their taxpayers. So one thing I think is that, it's public monies that go to the UN. And so some of what you see in the US context is a reflection of where the US government thinks it's most appropriate to spend its citizens' tax funds. And so I think that's something to just always keep in mind in terms of making the case actually to publics about the contribution of their countries to the UN. I do think what you've seen in the last couple of years, so let's just be explicit about it, we've had several rounds of budget negotiations and budget discussions in Washington, D.C. over the last couple in the Trump administration. And we've interestingly seen a pattern in which the executive branch tables budgets that are extremely draconian and making pretty significant cuts in different places. And so far, what we've seen is the US Congress saying no. The US Congress has been comparatively more steady in the set of commitments that the US at least has always made to the UN. Now, part of that's the regular budget and the assessed dues, and we're going into a big negotiation on exactly that at the UN now about the comparative assessment that different countries pay to contribute to the UN. A lot of it's about the voluntary funds, and so the agencies that you're describing, a lot of that is in the voluntary funding arena. And the base of support for that work, whether it's the High Commissioner for Refugees or it's the World Food Program, I don't think it's so much that there's an American who happens to run the World Food Program at the moment. I think it's more that there is a very deep base of appreciation for the UN's humanitarian work and the scale of that work. And that's more what you're seeing a reflection of when it comes to congressional and US government support for some of the humanitarian agencies. But you're right, we're entering a period in which there are budget pressures generally, and there is always a question of what gets trimmed and how and what the basis for that is. So I think if I were, where I tend to look and where I think is extremely interesting is in the interplay between the authorizing authorities of the US Congress and the debate and discussion with the executive branch of government. And I think that's a space certainly to watch.
Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Charles Gore. I used to work in UNCTAD, responsible for research on least developed countries. I'd like to ask you, what were the specific goals of America in the SDG negotiation?
Oh, that's actually, on the one hand, easy, on the other hand, a hard question. I mean, I think the first broad goal was a really deep sense of the opportunity to, because remember, at the beginning, there was even a debate, even in the, broadly speaking, in the UN community, certainly in the development community, about whether there even should be SDGs. Or should there just be a kind of follow-on to the Millennium Development Goals to finish the business and not get distracted? And there was a worry that, that some countries, some issues would get lost in trying to create a successor set of goals. So one of the big early debates was that, and we had a very robust debate in the US government about what our position was on it. It had very different points of views internally, as there was a debate about that, I think, in the world at large. We, and I say we at the time because I'm remembering my old hat, took the position that the best way to get traction on some of the unfinished business of the MDGs was, in fact, to craft a new framework that would embrace them, but put them into connection with other sets of issues. And where we particularly saw the opportunity was to craft a successor framework of goals that wasn't as siloed between issues, but that would actually tackle some of the underlying drivers of development outcomes, whether that's the equality of women, whether that's inequality in the world, whether it's sustainable consumption and production, whether it's climate change, that there was a chance to think in a much more strategic way, or peace is an obvious one, a strategic way to think about what produces development outcomes of a variety of kinds, and set some goals around that. That's one of the chief reasons that the U.S. was among those who was an early champion of a goal that related to peace and governance, because we saw that the path to poverty eradication and the path to development for any number of countries had to go through peace at some point. And we were listening to a lot of countries who told us exactly the same thing. They're the ones who told us that in the negotiating room, and they've been telling the world that from their own experience. So that was the kind of ethos that really drove the US position. I would say, comparatively speaking, I felt lucky to be a negotiator at that time because we had we're fairly open-minded on a number of issues where we could see different sides of the coin and wanted simply to have a constructive solution. So I'll use the example of a goal on climate change. Up until the end, it was not likely to get a goal on climate change for a number of reasons. And very fortunately, we were in the position of being able to say, if there is a goal of climate change, we're happy to support it, and here's what we'd like to see in it. We can also see a way to live without a goal on climate change, and it's part of the reason that as a negotiating team, we worked really hard before we knew what the answer was going to be to embed targets throughout the entire framework that added up to a really robust strategy on climate change. One of them is an energy goal, which we have, and some of them are targets on sustainable agriculture or ocean acidification or resilient cities. So we kind of played it in that way. So we were not as, you might think we had 2 or 3 must-haves, we absolutely have to have this to succeed, but actually that wasn't really our posture in this, because we saw more strategic opportunity in development to kind of start a fresh way of thinking about it.
I'm Jeff Rowland, formerly of the World Food Program, and now of Gavi. And I just, something that really weighs on my conscience still was the disastrous response several years ago of the mass immigration across Europe. And I just want to get your perspective on how much of that was a failure of multilateralism. Can you give us your perspectives from where you sit about the response to that crisis? What went wrong in the multilateral community, in the UN, and member states that that still has effects today that I see as a resident of Europe? Thank you.
That's a very tough one, and it's hard to know where to start, because you can talk about the drivers of those waves of immigration and specific crises that propelled a lot of them. You can talk about development failures, about where people find a place to make a reasonable life and a safe life for themselves and their families. There are obviously challenges on the European side, and you would, and others in the room would probably be better able to speak to that than I. I think ultimately that, like many other situations, is a failure of humanity. I mean, it's a failure of politics on a lot of different levels. More than it's a failure of multilateralism, I think it's a failure of a kind of ability to see a humane form of politics. And I'd give the counterexample to me, which remains just astonishing every time I think about it, and I think probably for many of us, of Jordan. Jordan is an extremely fragile country in a very complicated region. We all know that. When you think about the scale of displaced people that country has taken in, to homes, to communities, to their workforce, with every possible risk of instability in that country, and yet so far is doing it with grace and compassion, I think that almost to me stands more as the counterpoint to what has really failed, which I think is not even so much a failure of multilateralism. I think it's a deeper failure of basic humanity and political compassion.
With the support of the United States, could not come up with an adequate response in Europe when you see a country like Jordan who accepted a massive amount of immigrants. I don't get it.
I will confess I don't get it either.
Good evening. Hi, Ambassador. Hi, Elizabeth. In Northern Ireland, also now a long-time humanitarian human rights worker, but also now with United Against Inhumanity, which is a citizen-led movement. It's very new, so it hasn't moved very much still. But partly triggered by the last question, plus some earlier comments and non-comments. I mean, the way I see it, what happened in 2015 in Europe, and I'm a European, was a failure of solidarity, a failure of our values. And I think it's our governments, but also, I will say, our societies that have gone along with this. We've seen the rise of, we're talking about multilateralism, we've seen the rise of populism, nationalism, very, very narrowly defined, which is actually akin to fascism in many instances. And so coming here this evening to have a discussion on multilateralism, I partly thought it would be about that. I think we all know that our world is living and dying, a lot of us, at a time of great turbulence and huge question marks. So I totally agree with you that there has to be new ways of working, new ways of thinking, because what I'm also seeing is, and I'm glad to see there's a lot of young people in the room, and in 2015, I was also a volunteer in Lesbos. It was mostly young people, and basically they were voting with their feet to go and trying to be of help. because our governments and our societies were not. But I think one of the things that's missing in this discussion is the role of globalization and the extent to which governments have lost their agency and their capacity to deal with issues. I mean, it's not just globalization, but we see a rise in inequality, which is linked to why there's so many people on the move, which is linked to, as I understand it, the rise of the other and this narrative. And unless and until all of us, both our governments, but also our individuals in society, come to grips with that, you know, multilateralism as we've known it is not going to be able to deliver because member states are not delivering for their own societies.
You know, I agree with that. That's why I was saying earlier, I think the most repair work needs to be done at home, and it needs to be done in communities and in societies grappling with precisely those kinds of pressures. I mean, it's a very, it's obviously a very vexing time where I share, you know, your point as well about the pressures on states and on governments who are not all behaving terribly well in the midst of those pressures, either because they've lost some capacity, but often because they are responding to or stimulating a different set of anxieties among their populations. And often that goes in a very, very destructive direction these days. But that, to me, is where the kind of most foundational work needs to happen. I agree with that.
Yeah, maybe to follow on from that, I find this a kind of very, very interesting kind of perspective that, in a sense, also situates somewhat much of the achievements of the UN that you've been talking about, which have been large, like to a big extent, in security, humanitarian action, you know, things that obviously wouldn't have been done had the UN not been there. But obviously the UN has for quite long been a difficulty to occupy the field of economic cooperation in a similar way, right? ECOSOC has done things, and obviously in development cooperation has done quite a lot, but much of it has gone to the sort of kind of neoliberal institutions like the WTO and sort of investment cooperation and the like, which of course means there's a multilateral transformation of the economy going on that the UN itself is only partly involved in and somehow has to kind of do the hard work of picking up the pieces left by that juggernaut of globalization, right? So how can the UN work with that, except being the problem of being associated with globalization to some extent, and at the same time being relatively impotent in a sense in that area to deliver much because it's not really the focus of action.
I actually think, I mean, part of the answer, I mean, first of all, I also don't want to be misunderstood in thinking that by talking about multilateralism, I'm talking about a kind of superstructure of institutions. I mean, it is partly about that, but to me, it's much more at a fundamental level about whether countries are prepared to enter into cooperative projects together. They can take a variety of forms, but whether they see a kind of fundamental interest and common interest in cooperation to pursue some common aims. But when you think about the entire landscape that we're talking about, it's a very plural ecosystem of institutions. You've just named a number of them. I think for the UN, it is both central, but it also doesn't need to do everything. And it shouldn't do everything. Part of the answer, I think, for the UN is not reaching into areas that are not its domain and having an understanding about division of labor of who carries what sorts of roles and missions in the world. And that's an important piece of it. I think part of the answer with the UN is the normative component of the UN. It's not just what it delivers out there in the world, which is significant, especially in the humanitarian arena, but it's also about the kind of values basis from which it argues for the rights and dignity of people in a variety of circumstances. And that has historically been a really important counterpoint to some of the other more technical institutions in the development sphere, and I think it remains so. You know, we didn't talk about the fact that this is also the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is a moment for reminding ourselves in many, many different ways about first principles and about what this sort of whole infrastructure was really set up to do at the end of the day and for whom. And I think that's an important grounding to not only restore but be even more forceful about. And that's something that the UN has a really particular role and a particular voice in being able to advocate for, whether it's in the development arena or it's in others. but particularly also to speak to this whole question about globalization, the strains on societies, the divisions that we're seeing in far too many places that, you know, at the moment are pitting people against each other when actually they have more, they probably ultimately have more in common than not.
Further questions, comments, provocations? Yes, we have a little bit more time, so here in the front and then in the back.
Thank you. Hi, Elizabeth. I'm Guilherme, the ambassador of Brazil for disarmament in Geneva right now. I would be interested in your views regarding what I perceive to be a sort of a withdrawal of countries from legally binding commitments and treaty making, which is perhaps the demise of international law to a certain extent. Wouldn't that undermine prospects for the UN in the future? Or is there a way to replace it with other kinds of agreements or cooperative arrangements that are don't follow the same path as we're used to doing? Because the UN, the normative side is expressed through agreements, through treaties, through resolutions and these decisions. And I see there's no appetite today often to engage in new ones, and the old ones are sort of drifting away.
Yeah, well, this is partly why, and it's good to see you. We did work in some of those basement rooms together. I mean, it's a very real threat and a very real risk. And I think even when regimes underperform in any number of ways, moving away from them decisively is something that's a very dangerous thing to do right now, because the prospects of putting them back together, even in new forms, becomes very slim if you do that. So I worry a lot about exactly that. I think it's not so, I mean, part of it is about countries perhaps walking away from treaties. It's also the risk of countries walking away from other arrangements and instruments for cooperative action, which to me is a fairly grave threat. I mean, even if one goes through a period where it's not quite clear who's performing in what way and to what effect, we are far better served retaining the kind of infrastructure of cooperation that we have today and thinking about how to revitalize, renovate, redirect it, add to it, than we are to dismantle it. I think particularly at a time of populist tendencies, of centrifugal pressures, and of global threats that are really quite monumental in the challenge they pose to us, not just as countries, but as a species. So I think that's quite weighty, feels pretty heavy at times, but I think that's precisely why more attention to these questions and more creative ways of thinking, again, about the political underpinnings of, particularly for critical countries who wield outsized influence, Brazil is among them, sort of how countries are going to play their hand in different international arenas are going to be incredibly consequential for the paths that either shut down or open up. So I think that's exactly the right question. It's what we all need to be working on in different ways, I think, together, for those of us who believe that there is a value in having these cooperative arrangements, mechanisms, treaties, et cetera, that help us advance both individual and shared interests.
One last question in the back there.
Thank you. My name is Peter Splinter. I have a human rights NGO background. You spoke about the importance of the values that underpin the United Nations and that are promoted by the United Nations. In the human rights field, it seems that the United Nations is struggling today to have its voice heard clearly. Do the Sustainable Development Goals offer an opportunity for human rights promotion by the United Nations to go into new and perhaps exciting, more effective directions? Thank you.
Yeah, I think they do. I also wouldn't abandon the directions we should be in already that maybe more time-honored. But the SDGs started with the notion of two principles, I would say, that are directly related to your question. One is universality, that these are goals that ought to be relevant to all of us and that we're all responsible for and should be responsive to in some fashion. But the other is the idea of leaving no one behind. And that is a clear kind of moral center of that agenda. whether you express it as the furthest behind should be addressed first, or you think about not considering any goal or target met until those who are the most vulnerable meet it themselves. That is present and permeates the agenda. It could be elevated, I would think, further, but it's actually something that you hear really prominently, certainly from the leadership of the UN. Amina Mohammed, who's now sort of the prime engine behind whipping the system per se into its own contribution to seeing the Sustainable Development Goals through. But any way that, whether it's that framework or others, that people can remind themselves of why we're all in this business to begin with, whether it's politics or policy or advocacy, whatever it is, that it is ultimately about the welfare and dignity of individual people. I keep coming back to that statistic I offered to you, and it's a big number, so maybe it doesn't land, but that between 20 and 30 million people lived where they otherwise would have died because of the Millennium Development Goals. That's not abstract. That's a bunch of kids who made it past their 5th birthday. And that's essentially a question of fundamental rights to live. It's a right to health. It's a right to basic well-being. And I think any ways we can find in whatever arena, whether it's domestic, very local, or international, to champion that, to make that resonate, and to make that relevant for people is probably one of the most important things that we could do.
So thank you so much. Now we've covered quite a bit of ground, kind of the downsides, say, of Aleppo and the upsides of millions of saved children and adults. And we've gone through quite a bit of terrain in terms of institutional innovation too, not just the multilateralism of the past and the UN as we know it, but all kinds of new forms in which multilateralism invents itself, connects with citizens, builds new alliances, finds new forms, goes through goals rather than treaties, sometimes in order to achieve possibly greater substance. Lots of avenues in which we're going. Some of the big questions, I think, may be insolvable, right? The Security Council reform that obviously is stuck and has been stuck for a long time. But around that, there's lots of action and energy that is being channeled. And even though this doesn't mean that one can discard kind of the discontents immediately, but obviously it's important to get that message out that the glass isn't always kind of half empty and discouraging and threatening, but it is in many ways half full or more than half full in institutions that really at least make a difference to the world that maybe 100 years ago was really the world that we imagined and that we wouldn't be able to imagine today in the same way. And the fact that we cannot imagine it in the same way of countries all sort of dwelling on for themselves is in large part also a result of the multilateral infrastructure that has been created and grown over the last few decades. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for this very inspiring talk and for being here. Thank you to everybody for coming and feeding the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you.